The most feared Viking Berserkers. For centuries, Europe feared the Vikings. Their ships emerged from the mist like ghosts. Their attacks came without warning, and wherever they landed, villages burned. But among the Vikings themselves, there existed warriors so terrifying that even hardened Norsemen feared standing beside them. Men who fought without armor, men who screamed like animals, men who felt no pain. They were known as Berserkers. And according to legend, once the battle rage took over, they became something no longer fully human. But who were these warriors, really? Were they elite Viking soldiers? Religious fanatics? Drug-fueled killers? Or simply a terrifying myth born from the chaos of war? Tonight, we uncover the dark truth behind the most feared warriors of the Viking Age. The Viking Age began around the late 8th century. From the icy lands of Scandinavia, Norse raiders sailed across Europe in search of wealth, land, and glory. They attacked monasteries along the English coast. They raided kingdoms in France. They traveled deep into Eastern Europe and even reached North America centuries before Columbus. To medieval Europe, the Vikings seemed unstoppable. But within Norse society, war itself held sacred meaning. A warrior who died bravely in battle could enter Valhalla, the great hall of Odin. And for some Viking warriors, battle was more than survival. It was transformation. The Berserkers were said to dedicate themselves to Odin, the god of war, death, wisdom, and frenzy. Unlike ordinary Viking warriors, Berserkers did not simply fight. They unleashed chaos. According to Norse sagas, these warriors entered battle in a trance-like fury known as Berserker gang. Before combat, they howled like wolves, bit their shields, shook violently, and worked themselves into a state of uncontrollable rage. Then they charged directly into enemy lines. No fear, no hesitation, no mercy. Some stories claimed Berserkers could not feel pain. Others said iron and fire could barely stop them. To terrified medieval soldiers, it must have seemed like fighting demons. The word berserker itself remains mysterious. Some historians believe it comes from the Old Norse phrase meaning bear shirt. This would refer to warriors who wore bear pelts into battle, symbolizing the strength and spirit of a bear. Others believe it meant bear shirt, suggesting these warriors fought without armor entirely. Either explanation reveals something terrifying, because Berserkers wanted fear itself to become their weapon. Imagine standing on a battlefield over 1,000 years ago, cold rain falling from the sky, mud beneath your feet, the screams of wounded men echoing around you. Then from the smoke, a group of half-naked warriors appears, covered in animal skins, foaming at the mouth, screaming like wild beasts, and they are running directly toward you. Psychological warfare was one of the Berserkers' greatest strengths. Most medieval armies depended heavily on formation and discipline. Fear could destroy an army before swords even collided. And Berserkers understood this perfectly. Their terrifying appearance and behavior shattered morale. Some enemies fled before the battle even began. But the mystery deepens, because historians still debate one enormous question. How did Berserkers enter these violent trance states? One theory suggests they used powerful substances before battle. For decades, people have speculated that Berserkers consumed hallucinogenic mushrooms, particularly Amanita muscaria, the bright red mushroom often associated with ancient rituals. These mushrooms can cause hallucinations, extreme energy, confusion, and altered perception. Some believe this could explain the uncontrollable rage described in Norse sagas. Others disagree. The effects of such mushrooms are unpredictable. In many cases, they would likely make warriors less effective rather than more dangerous. Another theory points toward alcohol and ritualistic dancing. Intense breathing, chanting, drumming, and emotional conditioning may have pushed Berserkers into a psychological frenzy similar to trance states seen in other warrior cultures throughout history. And there may be an even simpler explanation: adrenaline. In moments of extreme stress, the human body becomes capable of terrifying things. Pain fades,
Fear disappears, strength increases. Modern soldiers have reported similar experiences during combat. Perhaps the Berserkers were not supernatural at all. Perhaps they were simply men who mastered terror better than anyone else. Still, the stories surrounding them only grew darker. Some Norse sagas described Berserkers killing entire groups of enemies alone. Others claimed they fought wild animals with their bare hands. One legend says a Berserker continued fighting even after suffering fatal wounds. Of course, many of these stories were likely exaggerated over generations.
But exaggeration itself tells us something important. People feared these warriors deeply enough to turn them into legends. And legends survive because fear survives. The Berserkers were not merely soldiers. They became symbols. Symbols of uncontrollable violence, symbols of chaos, symbols of humanity stripped down to its most savage instincts. Yet despite their terrifying reputation, Berserkers were not always admired within Viking society. In fact, many Norse communities feared them. Why? Because rage is difficult to control. A warrior who feels no fear on the battlefield may also become dangerous off the battlefield. Some sagas describe Berserkers attacking innocent people, challenging ordinary men to deadly duels, or becoming violent during feasts and celebrations. Over time, their behavior became increasingly associated with madness and criminality. Eventually, as Scandinavia converted to Christianity, attitudes toward Berserkers changed dramatically. The old pagan warrior cults slowly disappeared. Christian kings and leaders viewed Berserkers not as heroic warriors, but as savage remnants of a violent past. By the 11th century, laws in Norway and Iceland began outlawing Berserkers entirely. And just like that, the legendary warriors of Odin began to vanish from history. But did Berserkers truly exist? Or were they mostly fictional creations of Norse storytellers? The answer is complicated. There is evidence suggesting specialized warrior cults likely existed during the Viking Age. Ancient writings, poetry, and sagas repeatedly mention Berserkers across different sources. Some historians believe they were elite shock troops used to terrify enemies during battle. Others think later storytellers exaggerated their abilities into near supernatural myths. And honestly, both explanations may be true. Real warriors often become legends over time, especially when fear transforms memory. Think about it. A terrified medieval farmer watching a screaming Viking warrior charge through fire and bloodshed would not describe the event calmly. He would tell stories. Stories that grew darker each time they were repeated. Stories passed from village to village, generation after generation, until eventually the Berserkers became more than human. They became monsters. And perhaps that was always the point. Because warfare has always relied on fear as much as weapons. The more terrifying you appear, the weaker your enemy becomes. The Berserkers understood this centuries before modern psychology ever existed. But there is another reason these warriors continue to fascinate people today. The Berserkers represent something ancient buried deep within human nature. The part of humanity capable of violence without restraint. The part that can abandon fear, ignore pain, and surrender completely to rage. That idea is disturbing, because it reminds us that civilization is often thinner than we believe. Under the right conditions, ordinary people can become terrifying. Perhaps that is why the legend survived for over 1,000 years, not because the Berserkers were immortal, but because the fear they represented never disappeared. Even now, their image still haunts popular culture. Movies, video games, television, books. The screaming Viking warrior covered in animal fur remains one of history's most recognizable symbols of brutality. But behind the legend, there were still real human beings. Men shaped by a brutal world. A world of freezing oceans, constant warfare, and survival through strength. The Viking Age was not gentle, and perhaps the Berserkers were simply its purest reflection. Whether they were drug-fueled warriors, elite shock troops, religious fanatics, or exaggerated myths, one thing is certain. Across Europe, their name inspired terror. And somewhere beneath the frozen skies of the north, around roaring fires and blood-soaked battlefields, the legend of the Berserkers was born. A legend that refuses to die. Because history remembers kings, history remembers conquerors, but fear